talked about the whole process of sort of making the decision to apply. In this next session, we're going to talk about the whole process of applying. But a brief reminder about where we were in the previous session. It's all about, for research degrees, figuring out what excites you. What are you good at? What sort of skills and aptitudes do you have? What do you really enjoy reading about? Do you see yourself working very much in a team or working very much as an individual? Do you want to be sat at a computer in the laboratory, in the field? What kind of combination of that do you want? What's going to motivate you? What's going to get you out of bed every morning for sort of 3 or 4 years to actually work on this research topic? What are your values? What do you want sort of your project to be doing sort of for the world, and what will it be doing for sort of you and those around you? Where will it take you in your career? Ultimately, you want to kind of be asking lots of questions, taking lots of notes, being brave, trying new things, experimenting with new things, and then narrowing down to what it is that really suits you and what you really want to do. And then if you're thinking about applying, it's worth understanding the timeline that the application process sort of works on. So here at the University of Oxford, we're kind of towards the end of the sort of the admissions process for our 2026 students. There are still some places open, but we're already sort of moving towards the sort of the 27 entry, which will be in September or October of next year, which means that for a prospective applicant, now it's about sort of exploring what your options are, which institutions or supervisors might interest you, where you might be able to get funding from for your studies, and then checking, what the deadline is. There are still PhDs being advertised at the moment, including within the doctoral training centre, depending on your skills and interests. But typically at this stage, we'd be more thinking about the 2027 sort of entry process. So then you want to look at what you're going to need for the application process, check what information you're going to need, check whether you have to pay any sort of fee or whether you're eligible for any sort of fee waiver when you apply. And really early on in the process, you want to figure out who is going to act as a referee sort of for your application, provide a sort of a letter of endorsement for that. So most universities, not necessarily all, will ask for the names of 2 or 3 referees who are going to provide a letter of recommendation for you. And we'll come on to thinking about how you might do that as someone who's returning to study a little bit later on. Then you want to make sure you submit before the deadline. There will be an official deadline. We will always tell you, do not submit on the day of the deadline. All sorts of things can go wrong. Submit, well in advance so that there's going to be no problems with your application. But your referees are highly likely to be submitting their references the day before the deadline or the day of the deadline, because that's how referees are. So you'll be appointed the deadline approaching. We'll be reminding them, I have got this application process coming through. Could you make sure you do provide your reference? Then after you apply, the applications go through a process of shortlisting, interviews, then you make decisions. Here at Oxford, we make most of our decisions between January to May. But as I said, other things that might be sort of late advertised are still going on all the way through to sort of pretty much the end of July, sort of August would be the absolute latest, and that'd be an exception. So then the next thing to think about is, what stage are you aiming to enter at? And we talked a little bit about the different types of degrees that you might have sort of previously, sort of how you might be thinking about having. So as you've heard from some of our panelists, a master's degree is not essential for sort of science-based doctoral study in the UK, although quite a high proportion of applicants do indeed have a master's degree or one of those 4-year undergraduate degrees. So in some cases, even if you're thinking about doctoral study, you might want to think about a master's, if you want to go more deeply into a topic before you make that commitment to a 3-year or 4-year program, or if you think you don't currently have the up-to-date foundations for that program, or you didn't sort of cover it in your undergraduate courses. I actually did a combined master's PhD program because I wanted to go really deeply into the science of plant diseases, which was going to be the subject of my PhD. And I'd had quite a broad-ranging undergraduate program with sort of 1 or 2 courses on plant disease biology, but not the depth that I really wanted. You might want to do it if you want to sort of gain or demonstrate additional knowledge, skills, or research experience. Maybe secure, referees who can speak to your research experience from the academic study that you've done. In some cases, the master's degree will be an end in itself. It's a really valued or necessary qualification. And some universities offer, say, dual master's PhD programs where you do taught courses first and then go on to 2 to 3 years of research if you would like to. So think about the route that's going to be right for you. And then you're looking into kind of the different institutions you might go to, the different research groups, the different programs. Lots of resources available to support you, lots of online resources, but there's nothing really substitute for just getting recommendations from people, whether they are academics or employers or students, about where might be a good place to go. For science, obviously delve into the academic literature, what's hot in the topic, but if you really want to know what's hot, look at what's actually being talked about in the conferences. So where people have chosen to invite the plenary speakers, like, this is the most exciting person that we could get to talk about this conference right now, because that's, you know, where a lot of the frontier is. Often they're presenting work that might not even be published at that point in time. You might want to think about where a course might take you, look into any sort of destination information that's available. What do the graduates from that course typically go on to do? A lot of courses will have open days or open events. Here in the DTC, we do a series of online open events, sort of say in the sort of the autumn, sort of going through to winter. There are sort of sites for advertising masters and PhDs, findaphd.com and findamasters.com and Jobs AC UK, that you can look for specific opportunities that are being advertised. As you do that, say, figure out what sort of publications you might want to read, sort of to get you sort of deeper into the subject or the interests of a particular supervisor. And also try and find a bit more about, you know, who you might be applying to even before you email them, if you have any ways to do that. You know, are they going to be someone who's going to be sort of encouraging you to publish your work, go out to conferences? How long does it take to do sort of a PhD in that department with the supervisor? In the UK, PhDs are quite sort of regulated to kind of be 3 to 4 years. If you decide to go to the US, as I did for my PhD, there is a lot more open-ended. Sort of, it could be anywhere from sort of 5, 7, 15 years to do your PhD. When I went to hand in my thesis, someone in advance of me was being told, sort of, tell me why you should get an extra 6 months because you've taken 15 years to do your PhD. And I was like, take my thesis, take it. I've done 5 years. So it's. You might want to find out more about the research groups you're going to, the department culture. There might be particular things you want to look for in a program, whether it's teaching opportunities or outreach or entrepreneurship support. You might want to understand more about that, how that group works with other groups or other partners, if that's something that motivates you. Is there going to be skills training that's going to give you some of the skills that you might need, or how are you going to get those skills? You know, whether there might be opportunities to interact with industry or non-academic organizations. And ultimately, it might involve moving from where you currently live. So you're thinking about what might it be like to live there, particularly if you, say, like me, you think about moving internationally for your PhD. And obviously, if you might be moving to a country where you don't yet speak the language. In that case, you might want to think about the availability of sort of language sort of training, and that might be a stepping stone for you. And then obviously for many students, you know, how they're going to fund their PhD and sources of funding becomes a really key thing that they are looking for. So when it comes to actually sort of applying into sort of doctoral study, there are 2 kind of main routes. And the first one would come where you had a supervisor who has a particular project that they want to do that they may or may not have funding to do, but they've got an idea for the next student they'd like to recruit them to this project. And what can happen when you follow this route is different processes down the line. In some cases, supervisor has the funding, they're choosing the best student that they'd like to have for that project. It's a relatively straightforward process. More commonly, there is sort of, say, a limited amount of funding available, and the supervisor is nominating students. So they might have advertised a project, and then the most excellent students who apply to sort of more supervisors than there is funding available then get the actual funding to do their projects. And then also there are situations where the supervisors are advertising projects, but they don't have any funding associated with it. They're just hoping that somebody comes along who's got some funding from somewhere who wants to do that project. So you always want to understand the funding situation down the line. If you're looking at a doctoral program, like many of the programs that we have here in the Doctoral Training Centre, it's a slightly different process. Often it's the program who's recruiting the students. They may not be recruiting to a specific project. In some cases, they are. But normally there's an academic panel that's selecting the students, and then they're sort of basically selecting students based on sort of admissions criteria and an interview process. So typically there's competitive funding available for the students coming into these programs. But some of those programs may also make unfunded offers. That's going to vary a lot depending on the program. So the things to look for to know that you're looking at a doctoral program is probably going to have one of these names attached to it. It might be called something like a landscape award, a focal award, a DTP, a doctoral training partnership or doctoral training program, or a centre for doctoral training. You'll find different acronyms that cue you to the fact that you're actually dealing with a program rather than just straight departmental entry to work with this particular supervisor. So we're going to come back to supervisor. We talked about some of the qualities you might be looking for in a supervisor. And in some cases, you might need to find that supervisor before you apply and apply specifically with that name supervisor. In some cases, you might not. If it's a case where you do need to have a supervisor sort of that might want to support your application, then you're going to need to sort of find who are the potential supervisors for you, that they have research in the area of interest that you're interested in working with, look at their publications, social media profiles, what are they talking about at conferences at the moment. And then next step would then be to email the people that you've identified to get more information, having researched them really sort of thoroughly, and express your interest in working with them. Always attach your CV. In some disciplines, you might be attaching a draft proposal. Less common in the sciences, because more often you're applying to do something that they're actually proposing to do, less than something that you're proposing to do. More common in, say, the humanities or social sciences for you to be saying, this is my proposal for what I want to do. Unless you're self-funding yourself, in which case then you might be going on, I know I want to do this project, I have funding, here's my proposal for what I would do under your supervision. It is very common to send emails to supervisors and not get a response. It's sort of, in practice, you'll probably find that the majority of people you email won't respond. And that supervisors are often getting many of these queries, and sometimes they're not responding because they're not interested. More commonly, it's just because they've got a lot of things coming through their inbox, and even if they looked at it at the time, went, oh, I shall get back to that person, they look interesting. As everything else happens, that may then go out of their mind and into the depths of the inbox. So it's always fine to send a polite follow-up email to say, oh, I emailed you a few days ago, and often at that point, if they were interested, that's when they go, oh, I should have responded to that person, now I will respond. If you don't get a response at that point, they're probably not going to respond. But don't be surprised if responses come through quite some time after you've contacted them, or need a little bit of a prompt to get a response. And it's not necessarily indicative of whether they're interested or not. It's just that they're busy people with very busy inboxes. If they say, actually, I can't supervise you, it's fine to also say, do you know anyone else, who might be interested, who's recruiting? No harm in asking, and they might be, oh yeah, I know my colleague who's looking at the moment. So there's lots of advice online about how to find a research supervisor. This just links you through to the Oxford pages. So if you find somebody you think you might want to work with, then you're going to have to make contact with them. So the first thing to do is to really do your homework before you contact them. The reason they ignore so many requests is because they're very generic and there are a lot of them, and they can't see a real reason for them to engage with any particular query. So you have your polite, well-written email with your CV and your specific interest in their research that gives some idea that you actually have read about what they do and have an interest in them. If they ask to meet with you, then again, that preparation will stand you in good stead to actually sort of meet with them, discuss their research, your interests, ask questions. Again, supervisors are less motivated if they've just spent the whole time just telling you things and you've not asked them any questions at any point in time during that. Like, oh, that's all very interesting. Then again, they're going to be less engaged to sort of follow through with you. So try and have some questions in advance if you know you're going to go blank in the context of actually chatting to someone in person. And bear in mind, this is a two-way process. You're interviewing them to see whether they're a good fit for you. in terms of what your aspirations are, the research you want to do, the environment you want to be in. And the number one recommendation is always ask to speak to current or former students within their group. So you can actually sort of, if it looks like things are going positively and they're going to encourage you to apply, the next step is always, can I meet someone that you've supervised previously? If they're a very new supervisor, you would be their first student, you can always ask, can I speak to someone who you mentored previously, sort of as a postdoc or a senior researcher? It's always possible to get that advice. I mean, what are they actually like as a supervisor? If things are going well, then there'll be an opportunity where you want to sort of talk about the funding situation. They'll be very happy if you already have ideas about how to fund your studies, if they're advertising an unfunded project. But if you're applying for a funded position, obviously you're going to mention that in your initial email as well. And if you go to departmental websites, often there'll be a list posted in the autumn of the project that particular supervisors are interested in recruiting to at that point in time. So we might start with thinking about, what not to do. And this is sort of like a summary of like the typical sort of email that I get several of a day. It really sort of ramps up as we get into sort of the doctoral application season. This is, I'm a student at the University of Narnia. After glancing at your research summary, I find you are interested in sort of cerebral diseases. I am working on an unrelated topic. I would like to continue to work on this unrelated topic in your research group. I'm really interested to know if you've any PhD positions for September. I've attached my CV and I welcome the opportunity. So that a supervisor is going to be, I'm sorry, this is not the right person for me. And I did recently get a query that said, after glancing at your research interests, I contacted you. I also had one where someone said, I have previously contacted 2 other supervisors, but they didn't respond. So now I am emailing you. So there, a little common sense actually applies in these circumstances. So a better approach would be, where you have a sort of an email where you're saying, this is a bit more about me, my background. I'm applying for studying for an MSc in frost science at the University of Narnia. I've been following your work. This is what interests me about it. I'm currently working on this. I've got skills in this. My research experience is this. So it's giving you a lot more information to work with, to know that this person seems to have a genuine interest in your research. Obviously, if you're coming in, you're not coming sort of say direct from sort of a research environment. You might sort of, in terms of sort of the type of research you're doing, you might be providing a bit more context, sort of about what you're doing now, what you've done previously, maybe a previous master's degree. You're still going to need all that stuff about why you're interested in that person's work. But you might want to say a bit more about why you're now wanting to make this transition from what you're doing now to come into sort of to doing research in the future. And it's always good to sort of say, leave it open. You want to show enough specific interest, but also to say, obviously, if I have broader interests, if what I've expressed an interest in might be not what you want to do right now, because obviously whatever they've published is what they had funding to do 3 years ago. Whatever they want to work on for the next 3 years might be whatever they have funding to do now that they haven't published on yet. So you sort of leave yourself open. And then sort of getting sort of past this initial email stage, in biochemical terms, it's sort of all about getting the right sort of over the activation energy that's needed to get your email through to the response. So we need to sort of put energy in to get over that hump and get a response. And most of these pre-application inquiries do fail to overcome this activation energy needed to get a supervisor reply. Things that typically sort of challenge that is they have no specific interest in the supervisor's work. They've got inadequate written English. Remember, the end of this is to produce this 50,000 word document. So if your email already says that's going to be a challenge for you, then a supervisor might be less inclined to sort of support you sort of at that stage. You haven't provided enough information for them to make a decision. There's no CV. You've not given enough information on you. Or they just might seem to be, from the query, a poor fit between their background and experience and sort of your sort of research interests as a supervisor. Other things they might be thinking about, do you have the right skills or background knowledge? So again, you want to think, how do I overcome this? How do I demonstrate in the way I approach them that I do have the right skills and I do have the right background knowledge and motivation? If there's somebody who's got a very team-based approach, they might be looking for people who can really demonstrate their ability to work well in a team. But again, often if you're doing cold calling on supervisors rather than people who've actually advertised a funded PhD, more commonly they might be sort of saying, well, actually, I don't have sufficient funding, time, space, or a suitable mentor, to support someone, and therefore I can't progress this discussion. At that point, you can always ask for feedback. You can always ask for suggestions about other supervisors. They may or may not respond, but at least you've asked, and it might open up a door you didn't previously know about. There are, however, catalysts that can lower the activation energy and get supervisors more interested in responding to you. So that might be getting support from mentors so that you're actually making a good sort of application and a good sort of query in the first place. It might be about being able to put the research experience you have sort of to the fore so that they're aware that you've kind of got that. Internships or other experience might help you get those skills. Sometimes it's about advocates. Again, one of the really successful approaches some people have is if you know somebody within that supervisor's network and you email them, and then the person you know also emails them, or you may have received a query from this person who I encouraged to apply to you. And then the supervisor, again, is obliged to respond because you've now engaged their colleague and their network. So now they have to, oh yeah, I'll go and look at that one because I now have an endorsement for that from a colleague, sort of who's interested in that. And leveraging your network to know, who is recruiting, who actually has funding and is actually looking for students right now, if you can find the right people in those networks. Obviously, if you've got any sort of measures of esteem, you've got awards, prizes, significant achievements, that might look good. If you've got funding for the work you're going to do, that's always going to look good. You want to see whether there's some sort of synergy between things that you might bring to the project, maybe that supervisor doesn't currently have in their research group, or that sort of might bring sort of new things to the project. Ultimately, their experience of say working with you or meeting you might inform if you've previously met them in some context, that might help. And then just general diligence is putting the work in to put a really good query in the first place. A more limited number of queries that you've put considerable effort and thought into is always going to be more successful than 100 sort of scattershot queries that you haven't really put the thought into. If you get as far as actually being able to have a conversation with a supervisor, then there's lots of questions that you can sort of put on your list of questions to ask them. So questions about the research are going to sort of be already part of that, but also the key question, how many years does a PhD normally last under your supervision? So this is particularly important outside the UK and in the US, for example, they can be a bit more varying in length, and sometimes I think they're a bit like cicadas. You have groups that are like 5-year PhD groups or 7-year PhD groups, and you can try and find out how long in that supervisor's head does a PhD normally take to do. And that will often be reflected in what their students do. You understand more about their approach to supervision and guidance. You might want to understand, particularly if it's an advertised project, how flexible it is, particularly if you think you might want to go in a slightly different direction from the advertised project. Obviously, you want to talk about funding and training. You might be, again, these particular things you're interested in, whether it's teaching or entrepreneurship, going to conferences. Always the can I meet a member of your group question. That's like the mandatory question to ask if things are going well. And obviously, if you're coming in with a background where you might need something specific, you need to work remotely, you need to work part-time, you need to take out time from your studies to do something. If things are going really well, then that's the point to sort of start talking about that and say, what are the options for this? And then the other key one is just specific questions about the project to learn more sort of and show that you've thought and read about it. Most of your applications will include a personal statement, and the how to apply on the course page tells you what you need. Do you need a research proposal? Do you need a personal statement? Do you need both? Online, you're also going to find course-specific guidance on the length, structure, content. And your personal statement is where you're kind of telling your story to the supervisor, to the academic department based on the facts. So really just think about what makes you stand out, why are you interested, how do you hope to sort of use this experience, that you'll get through the degree study in the future. And then a research proposal, if a department asks for that, May vary, let's say, a little bit by discipline, but often it's something that you have developed in partnership with a supervisor rather than you just coming in cold and just saying, this is what I would like to do. So bear in mind that it's, say, in some ways more common in a lot of sciences to actually have this research proposal be something that's been informed by a conversation with a supervisor. But we say not always, sometimes it doesn't. And normally you're going to be outlining your research question, the background literature, but think about, the proposal, what is it saying about you? How does it build on your existing research and your skills and expertise? Is it achievable in the time available? How well does it align with the support that you might have available to do it? So if you're applying to one of these structured programs like the ones we have in the DTC, we're often not admitting to a specific project, so it's more about saying something about your general interests or your specific interests, but perhaps or saying, I'm really interested in these 2 or 3 supervisors, they really intrigue me, and explaining why and putting that into context. The decisions are made by a panel. The emphasis is on whether you meet the selection criteria, whether you fit the remit of that program and your potential to succeed in research. So that's what you want to demonstrate in that sort of personal statement, that you understand the program and you're able to sort of demonstrate your potential. Most of the programs we have in the UK of this nature are funded by the UK government, by UKRI. They have proportionately more funding for home students than for overseas students, so they do have overseas funding. Some programs are more flexible for home or overseas, and some might be limited to home. So also you might want to be thinking about sort of say where you might sit in the kind of the fee status depending on the type of projects you're applying for. If you're applying to graduate study, say the process, we're just going to illustrate it with the University of Oxford. You'd start, say, by visiting the website, finding out more about the courses, the fees, and the application processes. You'd be looking at what the entry requirements are. Typically you'll see them written as a strong upper second class 2-1 or a first class undergraduate degrees with honours. Bear in mind that usually there's an extra sort of nuance to that also substantive relevant experience in employment can actually sort of change, be part of what's taken into account. And then often they need to have proof of English language proficiency as part of what you need to have. Then you've got the deadlines. Oxford, they tend to run from December through to the end of January. It's going to vary by institution, but everything is geared around that the application. And for us, you have to apply by the December or January deadline to be considered for any of our scholarships, while say more program or project-specific things might be available at other times of year. So when you've decided you want to apply, look at the how to apply and the kind of criteria sections carefully. Figure out what documents you need. You might need to get a transcript from your previous degree. You might need to have contacted a supervisor before you apply. So figure out exactly what you need and in a timely way make sure that you have the things that you would need to submit your application. So say for Oxford it would typically be a personal statement or a research proposal, your transcripts, some references submitted by the referees, and then we've actually moved to having a standardized CV. And in the DTC, we also have like a standardized personal statement to kind of say, please tell us about these things. We want to give everyone the same information about what we are looking for, the information we need. So there's to a certain degree, there's less advantage to someone who's got an insider track. Oh, this is what you should put in an application. We try and tell you this is what you should have in an application. Some institutions, including Oxford, might give you a chance to provide what's called contextual information. I mean, all of them are collecting diversity data. That'll be things like gender and ethnicity and age. That's not normally available to the people doing the assessments. They normally can't see any of that. But they also perhaps collect additional contextual data that informs our decision processes. And this is particularly at Oxford focused around understanding the opportunity that people might have had to gain research experience or to sort of succeed. And being able to contextualise the applications in that matter. Some institutions, again including Oxford, allow you to provide a contextual statement, which is more of a free text way of saying this is more about me and the circumstances that I have been through. And at Oxford we actually have 2 different things. We have something called a contextual statement and an extenuating statement. So it's worth explaining a little bit what the difference is. Contextual, it's generally general background information. So it might be, oh, I'm a first generation student, I have been or I'm currently a carer, I'm from a low income background, I'm neurodivergent. Things that you think might be useful for us to know to make a fully sort of rounded judgment about your application and your background. Extenuating is more about specific factors that have affected the strength of your application. So, for example, in a previous degree, something dramatic happened and then that really knocked down your grades. That's where that would go in the extenuating circumstances. So notice that although I got poor grades for this course, this was going on at the time that was happening, and my university couldn't put appropriate mitigations in place for that. You'll need to have your referees. So think early about who they're going to be, usually going to be academic staff or professional colleagues. Approach them in good time and check what type of reference they can provide. Often references from employees are not very useful to us because they'll often just say, this person was employed by this organization. And that is basically what they say. And so if you're going to get one of those references, it really isn't adding to our understanding of whether you'd be sort of competent for research. You list who your referees are, and then the referees have to provide their references by the deadline. So then after the deadline, we review the applications, then you may be interviewed, and then usually the whole process might take 8 to 10 weeks. So it can take a while if you're in the general process. This is then followed by an interview in some cases. And an interview assesses, we're generally looking for academic and research ability, motivation and enthusiasm, again, that you understand what it is you're applying to do, that this is the right program for you, you'll thrive in the environment that you'll be in, perhaps a team environment, you've got great communication skills, and you've got the relevant sort of core competencies, taking into account any additional training that you might get through the program. So in some ways, the interview process might start with that formal or informal sort of conversation with the supervisor that might come before or after applying. But there may be one or more formal interviews, standardly probably about 30 minutes. Your prospective supervisor may or may not be there. Typically, a doctoral interview would ask you to give a 5-minute presentation or maybe slightly longer on work that you've previously done. There may be a pre-interview test, and that depends a lot on sub-program and subject area. Some interviews may have skills-based questions. They might ask you to sort of look at a mathematical equation or write a bit of code if you're going into the relevant disciplines. And if it's relevant to you, it is possible to request reasonable adjustments that allow you to perform to the best of your ability in an interview. So set yourself up for success. Ensure that you're really well aware of the background literature and context, that you're able to explain what you've done, the directions for future work. Think about the sort of, in the previous work you're talking about, what are the challenges you had to overcome? How did you approach them? What is that saying about you to the interview panel, whether it's resilience or creativity or your willingness to seek assistance? Be able to expand on where you would go in future work. And if you're asked to give a presentation, practice it and make sure you can do it within the time available, because otherwise you'll just be cut off. They'll be like, nope, we don't have more time. Because bear in mind that this interview is 30 minutes long, and usually they have a set of questions that they need to get through. So your answers have to be to the point so that we can kind of get through all the information we need within that 30 minutes. So then the next phase might be talking about the project you want to do. So you understand, the type of hypotheses or questions that are important in the field, what type of methods you might use, the challenges you might face, what excites you about it. Key thing, if you're applying for a specific project with a supervisor, you should already have asked these questions of the supervisor so you know the answers to the questions. So that conversation would be, what do you think is going to be particularly challenging about this project? So you can already get some of that information from that interaction with the supervisor. And then ultimately the invitation to interview will often give a very clear indication of what you're going to be asked about in the interview. Again, that's good practice for fair admissions, that you give an indication of what we're going to be asking about. So you can think in advance, what might you want to say about these things? And think about a range of examples. Sometimes people have thought, I need to come up with an example of my problem-solving skills. But they've only thought of one example. And as soon as you ask them a second example of their problem-solving skills, they draw blank because they prepared one answer to that question. So think about having more than one answer sort of in your your repertoire. And bear in mind, the last question is likely to be, do you have any questions? Typically, they're looking for at least 1 or 2 questions. People are not asked, they, at that point, have 10 minutes for a sort of further discussion if it's a sort of a regular program of interviews. Obviously, there might be specific things to think about if you're interviewing as a returning student. You know, if you're presenting on previous work, any previous research you did as a part of a previous degree might be a long time ago. So you might need to think about whether you want to present that, whether you want to present something that you've worked on more recently, and refreshing your knowledge on what you might want to present. If you're presenting on work perhaps you've done in a professional context, you're going to have to think about what you're able to disclose or not disclose, but also think about what can I say that's really going to tell the interviewers what they need to know about me whilst maintaining that confidentiality. And in some cases, people just really don't have a research project to present. It may be the nature of the degree they did or the previous work they've done, and it might be possible to request an alternative. And so that might be, for example, presenting a paper that isn't your work but is an example of work in the field, or it might be that, say, you're applying in a discipline like mathematics, where it might be more about demonstrating your mathematical problem-solving skills rather than presenting on a specific project. So really think about your strengths. Bear in mind, as a returning student, you actually have a lot of strengths over some of our regular applicants. You have more breadth of experience. You have more professional skills. You probably have more evidence of resilience, commitment, and sort of motivation than some of our applicants. You've often got great team skills from working in a sort of a work environment, or great communication skills. So you're not necessarily at a disadvantage. You bring distinctive strengths to this.